Okay, so welcome back everyone to this final session in the thought training course. So in terms of Dodrupchen Rinpoche's text, we're about halfway through, but we've covered most of the major points, but I will try to complete the whole thing by the end of this hour. We'll see how we go. So after pointing out those techniques that you can apply when you have problems, then there's the advice given by Rinpoche here that you train in the small problems and sufferings first, and then gradually train to be able to handle even the big ones. And then next he talks about what you do in between sessions and the best way to realize thought transformation. So I'll just read the next couple of paragraphs. In between meditation sessions, pray to the Lama and the three jewels, be able to make suffering become the path. And when your mind is a little bit stronger, then make offerings to the three jewels and negative forces and insist that they put you in troublesome situations so that you can work on developing the strength of your practice. Here you should always have a deep, confident joy and cheerfulness. When you first begin this training, it is vital when you practice to keep apart from busyness and distraction. In the midst of busyness, you can get influenced by all kinds of misdirected friends who will ask you, how can you possibly put up with such suffering and humiliation? Worrying a lot about enemies, relatives, and possessions will cloud your awareness and disturb your mind beyond your control so that you slip into bad habits. Then on top of that, you will get lost in all kinds of distracting objects and situations. In the solitude of a retreat environment where none of these things exist, your rigpa, or your awareness, if you'd like that translation, will be very clear. And as a result, it will be easy to settle the mind and concentrate. It is for this very reason that when practitioners of Che train their minds in suppressing suffering, at the beginning they put off doing the practice using the harm caused by human beings and amidst distraction, but instead make a point of practicing with the illusory manifestations of gods and demons in cemeteries and other such wild and desolate places. So I mentioned this before, how, these lamas lived in a different world from ours. And so for them to say, the ideal is to be in solitude, to do retreat on thought transformation away from distractions, then for most of us, even those who have changed their aspect with the hope of dedicating their life to the spiritual path, find it difficult to have long periods away from centers or other duties. So while this is the ideal and something we should try to do, and I definitely recommend that if you have this space in your life, to do retreat for as long a period as you can manage, whether it's even a day, a weekend, or a week or longer, is very useful, especially solitary retreats, if you could manage that, because it is true that when you're doing retreat in an isolated place away from your usual life, that your mind does get calmer and you do get rid of a lot of distractions in life, and gives you a chance to actually observe your mind in solitude and recognize what you need to do in terms of transforming your mind and actually apply methods. So while the ideal is to do that as often as possible, in reality, there's not a lot of us that get the chance to go away and do solitary retreat. So the thing to do is to try to do as much as we can in our everyday living situation to minimize distraction and to remind ourselves of the practice. So I'd strongly recommend to people that at least once a day, and ideally twice a day, that they have a habit of doing some meditation practice. It doesn't need to be long, but it's helpful if it's consistent. So for most people, what's recommended is morning and evening practice, whatever. And again, it's creative and what works for you, it's individual. So while you might get certain commitments from lamas when you take initiations and take certain teachings, you also have a lot of freedom in terms of the prayers and practices that you do. And so as we all know, some practices resonate really strongly and you feel a real heart connection with them. They seem to help you to improve the mind. So choose the practices that do move your mind. But as we were just discussing during the discussion period, just realize that you have to be patient, that it's not like, unfortunately, it's not that inspiration comes every day. Sometimes everything feels very routine and even boring. And you have to have the faith to persist during those kind of little bit desert-like periods And then just occasionally, well, if you're lucky, more than occasionally, you get some insights or something that moves your mind and encourages you in your practice. So now Dodrupchen says, to sum up, not only so that your mind will not be affected by any problematic situations or suffering, but also to be able to draw happiness and peace of mind out of these things themselves, you should put a stop to the attitude of not wanting things like illness inside or enemy spirits and disruptive talk outside, and instead get used simply to the feeling of being pleased and delighted. To do this, you need to stop regarding dangerous and threatening situations as something wrong and put all your energy into training yourself to see them as fruitful, valuable, and positive. And so he's given us those different techniques we can learn to apply so that we are able to see what would normally be regarded as difficult situations or problems as fruitful, valuable, and positive. Whether something is pleasing or not depends entirely on how the mind grasps onto it. For example, if someone consistently dwells on the shortcomings of worldly distraction and enjoyment, no matter how much his wealth or the number of people around him increase, he will only become that much more sick and tired of them all. On the other hand, someone who sees all this worldly enjoyment as beneficial will even aspire to increasing his prosperity and status. So again, that's just re-emphasizing how everything comes from our mind and how we label things. So next, Dodrupchen points out the kind of benefits that come if you do this practice. It's mind training. And I guess how you know that you're making some progress with it. So he outlines here 6 or 7 different things. So he says your mind and character will become gentle and flexible. It will become broader and more open. You will be more easy to be with. You'll be courageous and confident. You will have no obstacles to practice. All negative circumstances will arise as splendid and auspicious. And your mind will always be content in the happiness born of peace. And he says to practice the path to enlightenment in this degenerate age, you cannot be without armor of this kind. So I guess it's a way to gauge how your practice is going, but I think it probably takes quite a lot of practice until all negative circumstances arise as splendid and auspicious, and that your mind is always content in happiness born of peace. But I think even with initial application of some of these techniques, I think you'll find that you will become gentler and more flexible, less fixed in your ideas, and that your mind will be more open, and that you will be easier to be with, easier to be around. So he goes on to say, when you are not at the mercy of the suffering caused by anxiety, then not only will all kinds of suffering evaporate like weapons dropping from the hands of soldiers, but even illnesses will normally disappear on their own. The saints of the past used to have some sayings which can give us some understanding. So now he's quoting one of these. When you are not unhappy or discontent about anything, then the mind will not be disturbed. If the mind is not disturbed, the inner air, which is lung, will not be disturbed. That means the other elements of the body will not be disturbed either. Because of this, your mind will remain undisturbed and the wheel of constant happiness will turn. So this came up a little bit during the discussion group, this lung, or disturbances of wind in your body. So the Tibetan medical system believes there are different elements in the body, and when the mind is disturbed, it disturbs the elements in the body. And so that's why, as we know, when you're experiencing stress and anxiety, there are specific physical manifestations of it. And these you can take as a warning sign that something's wrong in your practice or something's wrong in the way you're living your daily life. And it's a good opportunity to sit down, relax, and just think about how you could be doing things differently and without triggering those kind of physical disturbances. So for me, my warning sign is I get an eye tick. Oh, you do too, don't you? That's right, because I triggered one in you one time. Yeah. So that's my little first early warning sign that I need to just step back and relax and think about the way I'm doing things and how much I'm doing, and either take a day off or, revise my approach to things. And I think we all have different. Some people it's an eye tick, other people it's an upset stomach or pain in the chest or breathing changes or sleep or appetite changes. And so it's just your body letting you know that your mind's disturbed, basically. And so if you want to settle those physical disturbances, then you need to work on your mind. And applying these thought transformation methods are something you can do to get your mind to relax about the things you're anxious and fearful about. Then he gives another quote and says also, birds find horses and donkeys with sores on their backs an easy prey. In the same way, negative spirits easily find a chance to harm people who are always prone to fear, but they find it very difficult to harm those whose temperament is confident and stable. So yeah, so what's it's saying here again is that if you have a weak mind, you have a weak body, and it makes you open to outside influences in a way that you wouldn't be if you were feeling confident and strong and stable. He goes on to say, therefore, those who know see that any happiness or suffering depends entirely on the mind, and so they seek peace and happiness from within the mind itself. For all the causes of happiness are already there, complete within us, and do not depend on anything outside. There is nothing or no one that can be hurt by any harm from sentient beings or anything else, and the same holds true at the time of death as well. You will always be free. The samadhi of the bodhisattvas, called pervading all phenomena with happiness, is attained in just this way. So again, this emphasizing the importance of what we do with our mind. It's not important so much what happens externally, but what happens internally determines the level of our happiness or whether we're experiencing times as difficult or as suffering. However, those who do not know chase after external objects in which they hope to find happiness. But whatever happiness they do achieve, great or small, it always turns out like the saying, it isn't you that's in control, your hair is caught up in a tree. Now, I couldn't find any commentary that explained that particularly dense Tibetan proverb. Your hair is caught up in a tree. Who knows? Anyway, it seems to be saying that unless you control your mind, you're not in control in your life, is the message I take from it. There is nothing but one failure after another. Things don't work out. You cannot finish anything and you make misjudgments. Enemies and thieves have no problem in doing you damage, and even the slightest criticism will separate you from your happiness. However much a crow looks after a baby cuckoo, it can never turn him into a baby crow. So your mind becomes just unreliable and out of tune. Then there is nothing that is not tiresome for the gods, a source of misery for negative spirits, or suffering for yourself. So this seems to be describing in its obscure Tibetan references, not all of which I understand, is that we know we go through periods in our life that just seems like nothing goes right. You know, that there's just whatever we try to do, we can't finish it, or we get it wrong, or we get criticized, blah, blah, blah. So in Buddhist terms, it's said that those kind of periods come, that you become vulnerable to external conditions in terms of causing you problems, is because basically your stores of merit are low. So your positive energy is low. And I think we all feel this. And you have experiences of the way you feel when you come out of a retreat, for example. You know, there's a certain very positive energy, and sometimes you notice that even other people seem to pick up on it. And my experience is it's just a matter of short time before it degenerates and you go back to your usual way of living. But I think it's an indication that because you've been in retreat, you've been doing solid practice. Most retreats requires you do 8 or 9 or 10 hours of practice a day. You're concentrating on the Dharma. You're trying to cultivate things like loving kindness and compassion. And that affects not only your mind, but it affects your physical manifestation. So that people actually see a difference when you first, as I say, first come out of retreat. And what I find is, unfortunately, it quickly degenerates because you quickly fall back into your old habits when you're returned to your usual life and your usual interactions with people, because it is so hard to break those kind of habits. In a retreat, it's a whole different little life that you've got. And in some ways, it's a very simple and quite blissful life. You know, you've got your sessions to do, not saying that difficulties don't come up, that the mind doesn't go a bit berserk or the body has problems. But because of all that, you're really concentrating on spiritual practice. It does make a huge difference to your mind and to your body. And you can see why in the olden days when this was the lifestyle, why people would feel inspired to go and do years of retreat in a solitary place. But of course, the test for how much difference you've actually made in your mind is when you're back living your ordinary life with the usual people you have to deal with, and whether you have actually made any stable progress in terms of being able to be patient with others and compassionate and practice love. So we kind of, the coming back to the ordinary life gives you a gauge of how much actual change there has been in the mind. So the thing to do is because we spend most of our life out of retreat, then we have to have methods we can apply in everyday life to make changes, to actually transform our mind. So that's the important thing to be aware of. Then he says, this heart advice brings together in a nutshell 100 different and essential points. There are many other ways of accepting suffering and hardships in practicing the path, and many other secret instructions for using illness and harmful influences as the path, as taught, for example, in the Shije tradition. I think that refers to one of the Nyingma practices. But here I'm just giving a general outline, which is easy to understand, of how to accept suffering based on the teachings of the noble Shantideva and his wise followers. So a lot of Dodrupchen Rinpoche's advice is taken directly from A Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life by Shantideva. So next, finishing this section on using suffering in the path, Dodrupchen Rinpoche talks about through the absolute truth. Previously, that was through relative truth. So then he says, with reasoning like the refuting of the four extremes, you can show that there is no such thing as negative circumstances or suffering. So bringing the mind into the supreme peace of emptiness, the as it is natural state of mind, remain there. In that state, not even the name of negative circumstances or suffering can be found. When you come out of this state, the way in which suffering arises in your mind is not the same as before, when fear and apprehension came. You can overcome them by regarding them as hollow, just like mere words. There's no need to say more. So this is the section that I moved to earlier, because I think it's important to have it in that list of techniques, because this awareness of emptiness, personally, I've found really valuable in dealing with problems. If you can always bring it to mind, it does make a big difference. You know, even if you don't have a very deep understanding of emptiness, even to just bring to mind something, you know, that first instruction to see things as dreamlike, it kind of gives you a little objective distance from what you're immersed in. So instead of being overwhelmed by the problems, you remind yourself of emptiness, that the way what you're seeing as a problem appears doesn't exist in the way that it appears to you, that you've chosen to label that in that way, and you have a choice about your labeling. Then even that kind of opens your mind, opens your heart in some way, and makes the situation easier to deal with. But you have to keep reminding yourself, because we're so accustomed to seeing everything as concrete. And even just to think of the fact that you've labeled a particular situation a problem kind of opens your mind and reminds you that you have a choice in the way you see anything. And like every day we get examples of emptiness if we are open to thinking about it. So for example, say two people get a cold, and then one person doesn't worry them too much, they don't see it as a big burden, and someone else dwells on it. I mean, this can happen with any kind of illness or any kind of situation. So that itself proves emptiness, right? Because if that particular illness was some kind of self-existent problem, then everyone who encountered that illness should respond in the same way to it, right? Because it's self-existently difficult, that particular illness. But there's nothing, and think about things like people's food preferences, all kinds of different things that we're constantly getting illustrations of emptiness, like chili, for example. My body just really rejects chili, does not like chili. But for other people, they cannot eat food. Someone's smiling. They cannot eat food without chili. It's like bland or tasteless. And if like chili was self-existently bad, then every single person that ate chili would reject it and say, no, that's horrible. I don't want that in my food. But we know that that's not the case. And even things like chocolate, which a majority of people see as blissful, cultures like Tibetans and Chinese, they don't see it that way. They see it as like repulsive or horrible. So again, that just is an indication of emptiness, that the way we hold on to things as self-existently good or bad is an illusion. It's a misconception, it's hallucination. And just remind yourself of that in your daily life when you're having problems, particularly with other people, you know, because what we do is we objectify them. And Lama Yeshe gives a good example, and he seemed to be saying that it's Westerners are more likely to do this. He said, like, if you have a really beautiful, a big, beautiful flower, but there's one little spot on it, one little black spot on it, the Western mind focuses on that little black spot and just discounts the whole beautiful flower, like it's ruined for them because it's that little black spot. And I think it's what we tend to do. We obsess about the faults in people, we forget their good qualities, and we objectify them as self-existently, inherently existently bad or difficult people. And you know it's not true because another person sees that same person in a different way, sees them as kind and helpful and all these different things. So just every day we're getting examples of how things don't exist from their own side. Because if they did, then every single person would react in exactly the same way to these people. Everyone would see that person as bad or that person as good. And we know it's not like that. So it's coming from our mind. And so we have to constantly remind ourselves, especially in problematic situations, that the way anything is appearing to us is not the way that it exists. And the best way is to look at this in absolute terms, in terms of emptiness, but you can also look in relative terms. And you know that from experiences in your life, how sometimes you can run with some fantasy about something you think you've observed someone doing, and you have this whole, you write a book about why that's wrong that they're doing this and why they're doing it. And then you can actually find out that it was a misperception in the first part, that what you thought they did, they didn't do at all. And so you wasted all that time having sort of negative projections about their motivations and why they do things. So we have to be careful to check up and to always have this awareness that we're labeling situations, that the things we label aren't necessarily, well, they aren't at all the way those things actually exist. And this applies even in relative terms, let alone in terms of the fact that nothing is inherently existent. So that's the absolute truth in relates to suffering. So now we move on to how to use happiness as the path to enlightenment. So again, Rinpoche divides this into through relative truth and through absolute truth. So how to use happiness in the path. So he says, whenever happiness or things that cause happiness come, if you slide under their control, then qualities like supercilious arrogance, complacent conceit, and laziness will grow, which will block off your path to spiritual development. It is difficult not to slip under their control, for as Padamba Sangye said, people can cope with a lot of suffering, but only a little happiness. So for this reason, you should look from many different angles at how all these things that exist are impermanent and by nature full of suffering. Develop a deep sense of disillusionment with samsara and make an effort to stop the mind drifting into a mindless carelessness. Reflect on how all the happiness or material wealth that this world can offer is but trifling and insignificant and bound up with all kinds of difficulties, even though some of it has a good side. So this is just pointing out that there are certain dangers in being too happy, if you like, in terms of spiritual practice. And I think we kind of know this because the times that our mind is more concerned about practice and practicing seriously is usually when we've got some kind of crisis or some kind of difficulty in our life that we're dealing with. And it's often, you read stories in the text and you hear stories about other people's experience, that often people become serious about Dharma practice when there's basically some disaster that they experience, something that's overwhelming. So a famous Gampopa, who was a famous Kyabje Lama, so he was a doctor. And what really turned his mind to the Dharma, to actually become a monk and a realized practitioner, was he lost his wife and his child in an epidemic. And so that turned his mind towards Dharma. He thought, the awareness of impermanence and death, that it's important to practice, there's no time to waste. And so from that point, he then became a monk and dedicated his life to Dharma practice. And there are many similar stories. And even amongst the friends you talk to, when you think about the precipitating event for meeting the Dharma or taking the Dharma seriously, it's often when a relationship has failed, or someone they loved has died, or they've had a big failure in terms of their job or something like that. It's not so. If you're happy, then you don't tend to be looking for answers to the meaning of life, because you think your life is fine. Why do you need to search for the meaning? And in terms of this, I wanted to mention something that came to me this morning when someone asked, on one of his tours of Australia, asked His Holiness the Dalai Lama the meaning of life. He gave one of the most succinct answers I've ever heard. He said, happy and useful. So for him, that covered the complete meaning of life. So I think the happiness relates to the self, so that the practice brings you happiness, and useful relates to the benefit you can bring to other beings. So I think that's a very succinct message there, that the meaning of life is to be happy and useful. And it's important that he emphasized the happy there. So yeah, when everything's going fine, then we tend to waste our time in distraction. And as it says here, we can come under the control of supercilious arrogance, complacent conceit, and laziness, because everything's going fine. So why do we need spiritual practice or to think about those kind of things? And so the danger is that it can actually block off our path to spiritual development. Okay, so then continuing. Buddha said it is very hard for a person whose freedom is impaired by suffering to attain enlightenment. For a person who is happy, it is very easy. So this seems a little contradictory to the previous paragraph. I'll persist with it. You should be aware that your being able to practice the Dharma in a state of happiness is a great good fortune and merit. Now, in every possible way, you should convert this happiness into Dharma. Also, as peace and happiness arise continuously from the Dharma, you should train yourself to let the Dharma and happiness be a help to one another. Otherwise, it will be rather like trying to boil water in a wooden pot. You'll end up where you started. So Buddha seems to be saying here that, and of course, I guess the way to understand this is that if you're born a human being, but a human being, say, who's in some position where they have no freedom, they don't have a perfect human rebirth to follow any spiritual path, then it's almost impossible for them to attain enlightenment. So, for example, if we were in situations where we had no money, we were impoverished in some country, and we were basically the slaves of others, where you had to spend your whole time just working to keep body and mind together, then you spend most of your time feeling either working or feeling exhausted from working, and there's no space for spiritual practice. Whereas if you have the kind of comfortable situations where we have what's called the freedom or the leisure to pursue spiritual practice, to practice the Dharma. So we should be appreciative of the fortunate situation that we have to follow a spiritual path. So then he goes on to say, you must get the essence of this teaching through applying whatever peace or happiness you enjoy to your Dharma practice. This is the vision of Nagarjuna's Rosary of Jewels. Even when you are happy, if you don't realize it, then it will never become anything you can use for practicing Dharma. So as a remedy against spending your whole life hoping for some extra further happiness with lots of projects and activities, you should maintain the nectar of contentment with whatever you already have. And along with that, put this teaching into practice. So here it's emphasizing a very important point about contentment. And so it says that contentment is the spiritual jewel. So if you're actually content or happy enough with your situation, all of that energy that otherwise you would put, that your dissatisfaction makes you put into grasping and attachment and desire and wanting more of, whether it's money or relationships or success in your field of endeavor, success in your work, then if you're content with your situation, if you're not rich, not poor, middle way, that you have enough to support yourself, then that contentment gives you the freedom to pursue a spiritual path. That you're not spending all your energy trying to gain things materially or to further your career. Instead, you can put that energy into your spiritual practice. So That's why it's called the nectar of contentment, that having that kind of stable, non-grasping mind, not grasping after externals, means that you can concentrate on your inner development. Then he goes on to say there are other ways of using happiness as the path based on recalling the kindness of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha and on the instructions for training in bodhicitta, but this will do for now. As with using suffering as the path, with happiness too, you need to go to a solitary retreat environment and do the practices of purification and accumulating merit and wisdom one after another. So as I said, this is the ideal, but not always possible. So we have to learn how to apply these practices in what turn out to be quite busy, distracted, everyday lives. Next is using happiness in the path through absolute truth. And this is the same as the case of using suffering in the path. So again, just being aware that all these things arise through the processes of being merely labeled. And it's also good to remember impermanence, that even when things are happy, when things are going well, there's no guarantee that it won't change, that things won't start not going well. So now Dripchen comes to the conclusion. And as usual, quite down to earth and practical, he says, if you can't practice when you are suffering because of what it does to your mind, and you can't practice when you're happy because of attachment to your happiness, then there will never be a time when you can practice at all. So for a Dharma practitioner, there is nothing more crucial or useful than this. So he's referring to this advice. And if you do have this practice, whether you live in a solitary place or in the city, whatever company you are in, good or bad, whatever comes, riches or poverty, happiness or sorrow, whatever you hear, praise or criticism, good talk or bad, you will never have any fear that it can hurt you. And so this is called the lion-like yoga. Whatever you do, your mind will be happy, open, spacious, and relaxed. Your character will be pure and eventually realized. Even if physically you are living in an impure land, your mind will enjoy the splendor of inconceivable happiness and bliss, just like the bodhisattvas of the pure realm. It is just as the precious Kadampas used to say, with happiness under control and suffering brought to an end, when you're all alone, this will be the companion of sorrow. When you are ill, it will be your nurse. Goldsmiths remove the impurities from gold by melting it in fire and make it flexible by rinsing it over and over again in water. It is just the same with the mind. If by using happiness as the path you make your mind clear and pure, then you will easily attain the extraordinary samadhi which makes mind and body capable of doing whatever you wish. So here it's talking about the kind of flexibility of body and mind that comes with pure concentration and pure meditation, which is achieved on the basis of pure ethics or pure morality. He goes on to say, I feel that this practice alone is the most profound and important for perfecting discipline, which is the source of everything positive and wholesome. This is because not being attached to happiness creates the foundation of the special discipline of renunciation, and not being afraid of suffering makes this discipline totally pure. They say that generosity is the basis of discipline and patience is the purifier of discipline. Through training in this practice now, then when you attain the higher paths, this is what it will be like. You will realize that all phenomena are like an illusion and that all these births are like walking into a park. Whether in good times or bad, prosperity or ruin, there will be no fear of negative emotions or suffering. So again, this is outlining the goal of this practice, to have this mind of equanimity that isn't disturbed by suffering in terms of becoming depressed or anxious or fearful, and doesn't become over-elated or overexcited when things go well. That instead you see these things of one taste, and that everything, whether things are going well or whether things are going badly, nothing disturbs your mind, and you can apply everything to the spiritual path, both happiness and suffering. Then he says, here are some illustrations from the life of Buddha. Before he attained enlightenment, he renounced the position of universal ruler as if it were straw and lived by the river Naranjana without a care for the harshness of the austerities he was practicing. This shows that one must have equal taste, no distinction between happiness and suffering, to realize the nectar of enlightenment and benefit oneself. Then after he attained enlightenment, the chiefs of men and gods, as far as the highest realms, placed his feet on the crown of their heads and offered him respect, service, and everything he needed. However, the Brahmin Raja abused him and criticized him 100 times. A Brahmin's daughter accused him of sexual misconduct. He lived off rotten horse fodder for 3 months in the land of King Agnidatta and so on. But he remained without the slightest fluctuation in his mind, high or low, just as Mount Meru remains unshaken by the wind. This shows how you must have that equal taste again in order to act for the benefit of sentient beings. So what this is pointing out is that Buddha did undergo a lot of austerities, a lot of suffering when he was practicing on the path. And he spent 6 years doing extreme practices, as it mentions there, by the banks of the Naranjana River. And then at a certain point, he came to the conclusion that the really severe austere practices we're doing weren't necessarily allowing him to achieve enlightenment. And it's that point that he took the milk rice, he took some sustenance, and then he went and sat under the Bodhi tree and vowed that he would remain there in meditation until he became enlightened. And that happened despite various obstacles that came during that night. He was enlightened by the next morning. But then it's pointing out that even after Buddha became a fully enlightened being, it wasn't that suddenly everybody thought he was wonderful and everything became super easy for him and there was no criticism, etc. While many beings did appreciate the Buddha in that way, you only have to remember the stories you've read in different texts about his, we're sometimes described as his cousin, sometimes as his half-brother Devadatta, who was very jealous of Buddha and tried many times to kill him. And then they're pointing out different stories here, historical stories about Brahmins who abused and criticized him, about a Brahmin's daughter who accused him of sexual misconduct and how he had to live off rotten food. But the point they're making, or the point that Rinpoche is making, is that despite what could be interpreted as difficulties, Buddha's mind didn't have the slightest fluctuation because he was a fully realized being, a fully enlightened being, that it didn't matter whether people were praising or criticizing him. And there's that famous image that we learn about when we learn about refuge in Buddha, where it's said that Buddha has such incredible impartiality of mind that he can have one person massaging oil into his left arm and another person slashing his right arm with a knife. And he has the same feelings of equanimity, love, loving kindness and compassion towards both those beings. So that's the kind of ideal mind we're trying to generate through our practices, this complete impartiality. And so impartiality doesn't mean indifference. It just means that we don't make distinctions between people who help us and harm us, for instance, which is what we tend to do. We tend to favor the people who we think are helping us, supporting us in whatever we're doing, being kind to us, praising us. And we tend to wish to harm, or at least to be separate from those people who are criticizing or harming us in some way. So the ideal mind to have is this mind of equanimity that just stays stable and level with whatever's happening, whether it's problems or happiness. So then Dodrupchen Rinpoche concludes with the colophon. So he says, this kind of teaching should really be taught by the Jowo Kadampas. That means the holy Kadampas, so these Kadampa Geshis that I was talking about before, who in their lifestyles embodied their saying, never complaining when there is suffering and having great renunciation when there is happiness. But if it is explained by someone like me, I feel sure that even my own tongue is going to get embarrassed and fed up with it. And yet with the aim of myself making a habit of equal taste, whether I face happiness or sadness, praise or blame, gain or loss, fame or insignificance, I, the old beggar, Tempe Nima, have written this in the forest of many birds. So that forest of many birds was the hermitage that I was describing to you, where Dodrupchen Rinpoche spent his last 20 years of his life. So he composed this text while he was there. So this completes the text of turning suffering and happiness into the path to enlightenment. So before I just do a final little talk, if there's any questions that anyone has, please feel free to ask them at this point. And if not, I'll just do a little final advice and then we'll do a dedication for the course. So if there's anything you'd like to ask, please feel free. It doesn't seem like anyone's rushing with anything. Okay. So then just to conclude, I'd just like to talk a little bit about trying to integrate these thought training teachings into our daily life and how to have a steady practice. So it's good, of course, to read books on thought transformation. And there was, I did put together an introductory reading list, which I hope you all got, of suggested further reading. So I tried to choose there the books that are kind of more introductory than complicated with philosophy. And one of the ones I'd really like to recommend that I read for the first time after many years was Advice from a Spiritual Friend by Geshe Rabden and Geshe Dagi, which I think was published in the early 80s. And I probably read it sometime in the 80s. But I reread it in preparation for this course and found it very useful. But any of those books are quite useful. So in terms of how to incorporate spiritual practice into your daily life, I mean, given that we live modern Western lives, which tend to be busy and full of distraction and now full of different anxieties and fears in relation to pandemics. So as I was saying, I think the ideal is to at least twice a day make some space in your life for meditation, however simple, however short. Doesn't have to be hours, and for most of us, we don't have hours to spare, but some kind of, so the one in the morning, at the beginning of today, I pointed out those two activities that are recommended at the beginning and the end. So at the beginning in the morning, it's very good to generate a positive motivation for whatever you're going to get engaged in during the day. And then in the evening, it's good to do a review of how things went during the day in terms of your goals set in the morning. And then to kind of regret anything that you got wrong, and then making resolves to do better in the future, and then dedicating any positive energy, any merit you've created during the day to goals like the development, your development and the development of others in the spiritual path, whatever other personal goals you have. So ideally, it's good to have a meditation room. Now, not every house has the luxury of that. And some people live in one room. So it's good to at least set up, we call an altar, but it doesn't have to be as formal as that. It can just be a little area where you have the kind of pictures of people or books about things that inspire you. If you're a traditional Buddhist, then usually you would have images, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and of gurus, and make various offerings. But it doesn't need to be that formal. You can just have a little corner of your room where you have pictures or images of people and things that inspire you, that turn your mind into a positive frame of mind, that turn your mind towards your spiritual path. And good to have a cushion or a chair, and good to be able to have a time when you spend time in that corner and meditate. And of course, these days, ideally, it's good to turn your phone off during these periods, because we've become, I think, somewhat addicted to constant information and constant availability. But it is good just to be separate from interruptions. And whatever practices you find inspiring, whatever practices turn your mind towards Dharma, then concentrate on those. And it's good, for example, to start, the first step in the meditation is to check your posture. And as I pointed out when we were meditating, just to have your back as straight as possible is the most important point. And to steady your mind, to settle your mind with some breath awareness meditation. It doesn't need to be done for an extended period, but sometimes if you find your mind particularly distracted, just hopping all around the universe and going from topic to topic, not settling, then it can be good to even spend the whole session just doing breath awareness meditation, just patiently bringing your attention back and back to your breath as it gets distracted by different thoughts and feelings. And once your mind is settled, then you can choose a simple topic of meditation, and there are various introductory books around. One of the good books that's been around for many years is simply called How to Meditate by Venerable Sangye Kadro. And so it has very clear instructions on simple introductory meditations that can be quite valuable to follow. Or you may have particular things that inspire you, whether it's poems or excerpts from books or teachings or whatever, that you can choose anything you like really as your topic of meditation and concentrate on that. So it's also good to practice the meditation on toEnlightenment that I introduced you to before, and it can become as simple or as elaborate as you like. So you can understand from the visualization. And usually when I'm involved in the prayer-a-thon here, every Saturday for 24 hours, the monks and nuns in our organization all around the world do a particular practice recommended by Lama Zopa Rinpoche. And in it, there's a particular, we do recitations of Mani Padme Hung, the mantra of the Buddha of Compassion. And so I do a modified toEnlightenment meditation in relation to that. So you can do meditation, for example, on when you're sending out, you take on the suffering of people, for example, with COVID disease, COVID-19, as in the black smoke. And then you can send out as healing white light rays everything they need to be cured from that disease. So you can send out vaccines, whatever they need for their health and happiness. So vaccines, ventilators, whatever you can do. And bring to mind the people who care for those with COVID-19, and also send out everything they need to help them with their physical and mental hardships, their exhaustion, their anxiety, their feelings of loss. And you could, toEnlightenment can become almost an endless meditation. So even within the human realm, there are so many categories you can think of people with mental and physical problems, for example. You can visualize them and do the toEnlightenment practice in relation specifically to them, taking on whatever particular sufferings they have and sending out whatever they need. And so at the end, remember to dedicate as expansively as possible, and particularly good to dedicate for your own development of bodhicitta and for every sentient being to develop bodhicitta. So then, having done your little meditation session, then you get up and go on with your everyday life, but trying to keep whatever your motivation was in the morning, trying to keep an awareness of that during the day. And the magical thing about toEnlightenment practice is that it's kind of a hidden practice. You can do it anytime, anywhere. And so because you link it to your breathing, and we're always breathing in and out, and we might as well make it a useful process. So as you go around during your day, you're going to see different beings, animal and human, who are suffering. And so just as you notice the suffering of others, you can do toEnlightenment practice. You can actually take on that suffering at the level of your visualization and visualize sending out to them healing white light rays. And so, for example, if you've got someone who's coming to you with particular problems, they have personal issues that they want to discuss. So while you're doing the interview with them, they don't need to know, but you can be practicing toEnlightenment. So whatever problems or sufferings they're describing to you, they're discussing with you, you can actually visualize taking them on and sending out whatever you think they need to heal them from that particular problem, to be a solution to that particular problem. And so anytime you see an animal in pain or a human being in pain, someone suffering in some way, you can just, without anyone else knowing, do this practice of toEnlightenment. And of course, you have to understand that you don't actually have the ability to take on that suffering. It's said that beings with high realizations can actually take on the suffering, but generally it's just at the level, it's a practice to improve your own mind rather than to affect the external situation. So it's a way to increase and develop your own compassion and loving kindness and eventually develop bodhicitta. But you don't actually take on their suffering or give them, I mean, even though you visualize giving them things, they don't physically receive those things. But any suffering situation you come across, you can apply the practice of Tonglen and use that suffering situation to remind yourself of the nature of samsara and to develop loving kindness, compassion, and this precious thought of bodhicitta. And so then you make it through your day with this positive motivation and practicing as much loving kindness and compassion as you can manage. And then when you come to the evening, it's quite good, as I said, to also have a small meditation session, just to sit down in your special meditation area. And it is good to review what's happened during the day. And so to openly acknowledge any unskillful actions or unskillful words that happen during the day. So as Lama Yeshe points out, karma simply means watching your body, speech, and mind. And so the body and speech we can control to a certain degree, but not always. And the mind is more difficult. So just do a quick review and just see whether you physically hurt anyone during the day or whether with your words, unskillful words, whether you've hurt anyone. Bring those things to mind and regret them, because one of the strongest antidotes to these negative actions is to feel regret. And if you know any methods to purify, then institute those methods. And another important thing is to resolve not to repeat those actions again. So, of course, some actions, it's difficult to promise if you know that you're likely to do them again. So Lama Zopa Rinpoche says that a way that's more honest is to choose a period of time when you think you can keep, for example, if you're in the habit of abusive speech or harsh speech, and you think that, you probably can't promise not to do that for the rest of your life, but maybe you can promise to do it for half a day or a day at a time, and then review again how you went with it. So just resolve for whatever period of time seems honest to you, not to repeat that particular negative action or to repeat that negative verbal action. And then again, you can, if you have time, do some practices that help to purify negative karma. So in terms of Buddhist practice, the practices that are generally recommended are prostrations to the 35 Buddhas of Confession, which is a very, very powerful practice, or recitation of the Vajrasattva mantra. So if you're interested in Buddhist practice and aren't familiar with these, you can sort of do research or ask people who know about them. And again, start that meditation session by first settling your mind, because after a busy day, there's lots of things coming up, often garbage things that you need to settle. So begin each meditation session with at least a short burst of breath awareness, just to settle your mind so that you can concentrate on what you're thinking about. And then, whatever prayers or practices, or I know one monk who leads a very busy life. He's involved in the administration of our organization. So one of the things that he does is he always has a Lamrim text, a different one, and he reads like a page each day. And he just very steadily in that way, he can't put a lot of time into meditation, but just steadily in that way, he's worked his way through most of the major Lamrim commentaries, even hundreds of pages. Because if you read even just a page a day, then at the end of the year, you've read 365 pages of Dharma. So then he just reads a page and has a little time to meditate on it. And then the next day reads another page. So it's quite good to institute things like that. Or, some book, if you're not a Buddhist, then some book that you find inspiring that turns your mind towards whatever spiritual path you're following. And Lama Zopa Rinpoche recommends also that it's good. He's made this joke many years ago that's now wearing a little thin. he said that you should write down special slogans and things in your diarrhea book, meaning your diary book, right? So he got such a big laugh from it. So now years later, he still always calls it your diarrhea book. So that when he says something, and, he's in his teachings, Rinpoche is always saying, write this down, this is important. Your diarrhea book would probably be about this thick, given all the things that he thinks is important. But there are certain, like sometimes when we're reading, we come across a certain sentence or a paragraph that we really find moves our mind. So it's quite good to write these in a separate book that you keep on your meditation desk and you read when you need inspiration. And Rinpoche also advises that you can print them out in a nice way on nice paper with illustrations and have them around the house even, just to remind you. And with my mind, I think with those, I would need to change them, because you know how it is, you get blind to things that you see all the time. You no longer read them. So it's probably good to have a series that you change around every now and just to move your mind. Yeah, and so then you go to sleep and hopefully sleep with a peaceful mind. And so it's just good to incorporate your spiritual practice into your day. And also important to be gentle with yourself. Not to beat yourself up if you have sort of certain things and you don't achieve them, just to be realistic about what's possible in your life, especially if you've got a job that you have to hold down or a family to take care of. Just be realistic about what you can achieve. But as much as possible, just try to incorporate your practice into your everyday life, because for most of us, it's just not realistic to spend 8 or 10 hours a day on practice, because there are other things to do or we have other responsibilities. So the important thing is not just to think that your Dharma or your practice is those little periods in the morning and evening when you're directly saying prayers, but that starting with a positive motivation, you try to incorporate a different way of thinking, a Dharma way of thinking, into your daily life. And it's important to always be observing the mind, to always be checking what your mind's doing, because it's very easy to become complacent, to become arrogant, to think, even especially maybe if you're wearing robes, to think that, well, you're obviously living a spiritual life. But actually, you can be quite a long distance from a spiritual life if you're not careful with your mind. And it's a kind of fascinating thing to turn your mind inwards, not be so concerned about what other people are doing or saying or thinking, but to actually watch your reactions, especially in difficult situations. And that's the whole point of this mind training, is that it helps to train your mind. It helps to turn your mind into positive. And so that no matter what comes up, you're able to keep a stable, equanimous mind, and ideally see everything as being of one taste. So then I just imagine, because this is the only level I can talk about this, is at the level of imagination. I imagine there must be an incredible freedom. Because if you think about the fact that if you actually have this realization of one taste, if you actually have generated even contrived bodhicitta, but especially if you have the effortless realization, it must be an incredible mind. And I mean, I've observed it in lamas, but I have no personal experience of it. There must be incredible freedom where you're not at all concerned about yourself and your own issues. It must just give you incredible space in your mind for just dealing kind of positively and creatively with whatever happens to you. So there's not those hopes and fears that we generally live with, our anxieties. There's just this wish from the heart to be of benefit to others, to help others, and only this thought of cherishing others, and no thought of self-concern at all. It must be an extraordinarily open and relaxed frame of mind. So ideally, this is, if we continue with this practice, if we stick to this practice, then we develop that mind of one taste. And so then it doesn't matter what happens externally. And it's like Dodrupchen Rinpoche explains, it must be this state of constant bliss, where you're always happy, you're always cheerful, you're always relaxed, your mind is always open and loving and kind. And it doesn't matter. And you also, of course, have some wisdom, understanding, emptiness. So then it doesn't matter what gets thrown at you externally, whether you're praised or criticized, your mind's not going to go too far up or too far down. whether you have something stolen from you or whether somebody gives you some gift, again, you're not going to be too depressed or too upset about losing something or too excited about gaining something. And it's not to think that you become this kind of boring, bland person, because none of the lamas that I've interacted with are like that. So they have this incredible kind of clarity and alertness and kindness and all these other things. And there's a lot of joy, there's a lot of humor in life because they're not holding things as tightly as we tend to. There's not all those hopes and fears, there's not all those expectations about how things should turn out. So my hope is that all of us can develop this amazing mind of one taste. So thank you very much. I'll just conclude the course as usual with some dedication verses from Shantideva. It's a guide to the Bodhisattva's way of life. So just think that whatever positive energy, whatever merit we've created together over these 2 days, Saturday and Sunday, that we dedicate them to being able to practice this amazing thought training practice of turning suffering and happiness into the path to enlightenment, and that we also dedicate towards these specific goals as outlined by Shantideva. Through the virtues of having participated in this course, may all living beings come to engage in the Bodhisattva's conduct. May all beings everywhere plagued with sufferings of body and mind obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. For as long as they remain in psychic existence, may their mundane happiness never decline, and may all of them uninterruptedly receive waves of joy from bodhisattvas. May the blind see forms, may the deaf hear sounds, and just as it was with Maya Devi, may pregnant women give birth without any pain. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food, may the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find new hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their illness, and may every disease in the world, especially COVID-19, never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting one another. May no living creature ever suffer, commit wrong, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled, or their minds ever be depressed. In all temples and monasteries, may reading and recitation flourish and remain. May the Sangha always be in harmony, and may their purposes be accomplished. May sentient beings again and again make offerings to all the Buddhas, and may they constantly be joyful with the inconceivable bliss of the Buddhas. Just as they intended, may the Bodhisattvas fulfill the welfare of the world, and may all sentient beings receive whatever the Buddhas have intended for them. For as long as space endures, and for as long as living beings remain, until then may I too abide to dispel the misery of the world. So thank you all very much, and please stay safe and well in these challenging times.